The evening sky over Portland was painted in deep hues of violet and burnt orange, the city's towering buildings glowing under the fading sunlight. Dr. Olivia Reed stepped out of the grand conference hall, finally breathing in the crisp autumn air. It was a welcome relief after 3 days of navigating packed auditoriums, heated discussions, and an endless parade of professional introductions. The International Emergency Medicine Summit had officially come to an end. As one of the keynote speakers, Olivia had delivered an impassioned address on innovative emergency response strategies, a significant career milestone. She was among the few Black women to achieve such prominence in her field, and while the recognition was rewarding, the relentless pressure weighed on her. She had spent years proving herself in a profession still largely dominated by white men, where she often had to fight twice as hard to earn the same level of respect. Dragging her small suitcase behind her, she adjusted the strap of her carry-on bag. The conference badge still dangled from her neck, Dr. Olivia Reed, emergency physician, printed in bold letters. But for once, she was eager to shed that identity, if only for a few hours. All she wanted now was silence, a moment to breathe before diving back into the whirlwind of the ER. Hailing a cab, she slid into the back seat and sighed as the driver loaded her luggage into the trunk. The smooth leather pressed against her shoulders as she finally let her muscles relax. "PDX International Airport, please," Olivia said softly. The driver nodded, pulling away from the curb. The soft hum of jazz drifted from the radio, blending with the rhythmic sound of tires rolling over the asphalt. As the city lights blurred past the window, Olivia let her thoughts wander. She watched as people hurried along sidewalks, each absorbed in their own world. For all the energy the city exuded, she felt strangely distant from it, as if she were merely passing through, untouched by the movement around her. Her mind drifted back to the summit's final panel on diversity in medicine, a topic she had navigated countless times before. The discussion had been polite, professional, but beneath the surface she could sense the tension, the quiet understanding that, for physicians like her, success was rarely just about skill. It was about resilience, about enduring the subtle ways people questioned your authority, your competence. "Dr. Reed, could you share some of the challenges you faced as a woman of color in this field?" one of the moderators had asked her, voice steeped in forced sympathy. Olivia had responded with her usual grace, a carefully crafted blend of optimism and reality. But the truth, the one she rarely spoke aloud, was that the hardest part wasn't just the outright prejudice. It was the small, unspoken moments. The way patients hesitated before trusting her diagnosis. The surprised looks when people realized she wasn't a nurse, but the lead physician. The constant need to prove that she belonged. As the airport came into view, Olivia straightened in her seat, shaking off the weight of her thoughts. The cab slowed to a stop, and the driver handed her luggage to a nearby porter. "Thank you," she murmured, paying the fare before stepping through the sliding glass doors into the bustling terminal. The chaos of the airport surrounded her. Families rushing toward their gates, flight announcements blaring from overhead speakers, the rhythmic hum of rolling suitcases. But Olivia moved through it with ease, already envisioning the comfort of her first-class seat and the brief respite it would offer. Little did she know, the peace she sought on this flight would soon be shattered. As PDX International Airport came into view, Dr. Olivia Reed pulled herself out of her thoughts. The cab slowed to a stop at the curb, and the driver quickly retrieved her luggage, handing it off to a nearby porter. Olivia thanked him, paid the fare, and stepped through the sliding glass doors into the bustling terminal. The airport was alive with movement, families rushing toward their gates, flight announcements echoing from the overhead speakers, and the rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases. Olivia navigated through the chaos with ease, already envisioning the comfort of her first-class seat and the brief respite it would offer. She made her way toward the first-class check-in counter, a quieter corner of the terminal where the service was more personal. As she approached, a smiling airline attendant greeted her warmly. "Good evening, Dr. Reed. Headed back home?" "Yes, back to Charlotte," Olivia replied, returning the smile. The attendant glanced briefly at the conference badge still hanging around Olivia's neck, her expression shifting to one of polite curiosity. "Long trip?" she asked, scanning Olivia's ticket and passport. Olivia nodded, feeling the exhaustion settle deep into her bones. It's been a busy week. The attendant handed her boarding pass back with a sympathetic nod. Well, I hope you enjoy your flight. First class should be a well-earned break. Thank you, Olivia said, taking the ticket and making her way toward the priority security line. As she stood in line, she found herself reflecting on the peculiar nature of airports. They existed in their own strange limbo, a place between destinations, filled with people constantly in motion, yet never truly belonging. For Olivia, airports were one of the few places where she felt a certain kind of anonymity, a temporary escape from the pressures of her career and the expectations placed on her. The security process was smooth, and soon she was strolling through the spacious concourse. The shops and restaurants lining the terminal offered every imaginable indulgence, but she wasn't hungry. Instead, she followed the familiar routine, walking, observing, letting the predictable rhythm of the airport ground her after the intense days at the conference. As she passed a newsstand, she caught her reflection in the glass. She paused briefly, studying the woman staring back at her. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting, her deep brown skin glowed with a quiet resilience. Her short, coiled hair was neatly styled, framing her face with a confidence that had taken years to cultivate. Her professional attire, a pair of tailored slacks and a sleek blouse, was a testament to the career she had fought so hard to build. And yet, no matter how poised she appeared on the outside, the exhaustion in her eyes was unmistakable. She continued walking, her thoughts drifting back to the long road that had brought her here. Every step of her journey had been filled with obstacles, both personal and professional. Being a Black woman in medicine had meant working twice as hard, proving herself in ways her peers never had to. She had persevered, carving out a space for herself in a field that was often reluctant to embrace her presence. But even now, as an accomplished physician, there was always a part of her that remained guarded, aware of the biases that still lingered, the subtle ways people questioned whether she truly belonged. Olivia reached her gate and scanned the waiting area for a seat. A few passengers were already settled in, but she found an empty spot by the large terminal windows and sank into it. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through the unread emails from the hospital. As expected, there were several messages, questions about upcoming shifts, patient updates, and requests for her input on urgent cases. She responded to the most pressing emails, but her heart wasn't in it. Right now, she needed to disconnect, to reclaim a brief moment of peace before plunging back into the relentless pace of the emergency room. The boarding announcement came sooner than she expected. Olivia stood, slipping her phone back into her bag and making her way toward the gate. The airline attendant scanned her ticket with a smile, and Olivia stepped onto the jet bridge, the distant hum of the airport fading behind her. The moment she entered the first-class cabin, a small wave of relief washed over her. The wide leather seats, the dim ambient lighting, it was a world away from the crowded terminal. A flight attendant greeted her warmly, offering to stow her carry-on bag. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Reed. Let us know if there's anything you need during the flight." Olivia nodded, managing a tired but appreciative smile. "Thank you. I think I just need some quiet." As she settled into her seat, adjusting the recline and slipping her noise-canceling headphones around her neck, she allowed herself to exhale. For the first time in days, she felt a hint of calm. Little did she know, that peace was about to be shattered. The first-class cabin was a world away from the chaos of the terminal. Plush seats, soft lighting, and a quiet that promised the comfort Dr. Olivia Reed desperately craved. A flight attendant greeted her with a warm smile as she stepped inside. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Reed. Let us know if you need anything during the flight." Olivia nodded politely, her exhaustion barely concealed behind a tired smile. "Thank you. I think I just need some quiet," she replied, settling into her seat. She adjusted the recline, placed her noise-canceling headphones around her neck, and exhaled, allowing herself to relax for the first time in days. The low hum of the plane's engines and the soft murmurs of the few passengers already seated created a sense of calm, one that Olivia welcomed. But just as she was about to close her eyes, a small commotion near the front of the cabin drew her attention. A boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, sat in his seat, struggling with his seatbelt. His small fingers fumbled with the latch, frustration written all over his young face. Standing beside him, his mother, a tall, slender white woman, was too preoccupied arranging their carry-on bags in the overhead compartment to notice her son's distress. Her movements were quick and deliberate, her expression tight with irritation. Olivia's instincts kicked in before she could stop herself. Leaning forward slightly, she offered a gentle smile. "Here, let me help you with that," she said softly, reaching over and fastening the seatbelt with ease. The boy looked up at her, his frustration melting into gratitude. "Thanks," he chirped, his enthusiasm infectious. Olivia smiled back, but as she leaned away, her gaze met his mother's. The woman's face remained neutral, yet something in her expression made Olivia's stomach tighten. A coldness in her stare, a subtle narrowing of her eyes. A look she had seen too many times before. It was unspoken, but unmistakable. A shadow passed over Olivia's brief moment of peace. She quickly brushed it off, telling herself that the woman was probably just stressed from traveling with a young child. But deep down, the feeling lingered. More passengers filtered into first class, but Olivia barely noticed. The unease clung to her like an unwelcome presence. She tried to shake it off, leaning back into the soft headrest, determined to tune out the world. This flight was supposed to be her chance to disconnect, to shed the weight of being Dr. Olivia Reed, the ever-composed emergency physician, and simply exist. But the moment sat heavy on her chest, refusing to fade. Pulling out her phone, she scrolled absent-mindedly through her emails, updates from the hospital, scheduling reminders, patient reports. Work never truly left her. But tonight, she desperately wanted to push it aside. She let out a quiet sigh, closed her inbox, and set the phone down. The weight of the conference, the constant need to perform, and now this tiny but undeniable moment of tension made it impossible to relax. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, beginning their routine safety demonstration. Olivia turned toward the window, watching as the runway lights blurred while the plane slowly taxied. She closed her eyes, willing herself to drift into sleep, and then she heard it. A voice. Sharp. Irritated. "I'm not sitting next to her." Olivia's eyes snapped open. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she had heard correctly. The voice was hushed, but the tone was unmistakable, the kind of restrained frustration that masked something deeper. She sat up straighter, her pulse quickening. Had she imagined it? Then, another voice, a flight attendant's. Gentle, yet laced with confusion. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Is there a problem?" Olivia turned slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of the woman's face. The boy's mother. The same woman who had silently judged her just moments ago. And now, Olivia had no doubt about what this was. Her stomach tightened. She had been here before. But tonight, the battle she had hoped to leave behind was finding her once again. "Yes, there's a problem," the woman hissed, her voice growing sharper, louder. Her irritation was unmistakable now. "I don't want to sit next to her." A chill ran down Dr. Olivia Reed's spine. It wasn't just the words, it was the venom behind them, the sheer certainty with which they were spoken. The woman wasn't talking about personal space or seating arrangements. She was talking about Olivia, about the color of her skin. A wave of nausea rolled through Olivia, though she forced herself to steady her breathing. Her fingers tightened around the armrest, her knuckles paling under the pressure. She had felt this before, the quiet sting of doubt, the loud echoes of exclusion. She had seen it in the way some patients hesitated before trusting her, in the way colleagues had underestimated her, in the subtle expressions of surprise when people realized she was the one in charge. But this was something else entirely. This was blatant, unfiltered, ugly. The flight attendant hesitated, clearly rattled by the woman's hostility. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but all seats are assigned. We're fully booked in first class. There's nowhere to move you." The woman let out an exasperated huff, her tone turning even sharper. "Then move her." A dead weight settled in Olivia's chest. Her heart pounded as she felt the eyes of the other passengers on her, watching but saying nothing. Not a single person spoke up. The silence was deafening. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, her expression torn as she turned to Olivia. And in that moment, Olivia knew exactly what was coming. It had happened before. Different places, different faces. Same expectation, Dr. Reed, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. There it was, the quiet, familiar request. Could you be the one to move? Could you be the one to step aside? Could you be the one to make someone else more comfortable at the cost of your own dignity? Olivia's stomach twisted. For a moment she wanted to refuse. She had earned this seat, not just by paying for it, but through years of relentless work. Years of proving herself, fighting for the respect that had never been freely given to her. She had every right to stay. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to stand her ground. But she was tired. So tired of always being the one who had to rise above. Who had to take the high road. Who had to be the bigger person. And so, with a deep breath, Olivia unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. She moved slowly, deliberately, collecting her belongings with a calmness that masked the storm raging inside her. She didn't look at the woman, didn't acknowledge the smug satisfaction written across her face, the way she crossed her arms like she had won something. Instead, Olivia turned to the flight attendant, who looked visibly relieved, as if a great burden had been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you so much, Dr. Reed," the woman whispered, her tone genuinely apologetic. "I'll find you a seat in economy." Olivia nodded, saying nothing. She could feel the stares of the other passengers as she walked down the aisle. Some of them had heard everything, but no one had spoken up, not a single word. Their silence was a knife to the gut, cutting deeper than the woman's words ever could. She had been here before, and that was the hardest part of all. It was always easier for people to pretend it wasn't their problem. As Dr. Olivia Reed walked toward the cramped economy section, she kept her posture steady, refusing to let her humiliation show. She settled into her new seat, immediately feeling the difference. The wide, comfortable space she had left behind in first class was replaced by narrow armrests digging into her sides and barely enough legroom to stretch. But that wasn't what bothered her. It was the feeling. The feeling of being made to feel small, the feeling of being pushed aside, the feeling of being treated as if she were unworthy of the space and comfort she had paid for. As the plane took off into the night sky, Olivia turned toward the window, watching as the city lights faded into the distance. In the glass, her own reflection stared back at her, poised, strong, but undeniably hurt. She tried to focus on her breathing, willing herself to push down the frustration, to keep the anger at bay. She hadn't asked for this. All she had wanted was a quiet flight home, a few hours of peace before returning to the chaos of the emergency room. But instead, she had been reminded, once again, that no matter how far she had come, no matter how much she had achieved, there would always be people who saw her as less than. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her from her thoughts. A hospital notification flashed across the screen, reminding her of her upcoming shift. She grimaced and turned the phone off without reading the message. Normally, work followed her everywhere, an ever-present weight on her shoulders. But tonight, the demands of her job were nothing compared to the weight of what had just happened. She leaned her head against the window, closing her eyes as the plane cruised at 30,000 feet. She wanted to let the steady hum of the engines soothe her, but the past hour wouldn't leave her mind. No matter how hard she tried to shake it off, the sting of those words, the cold dismissal in the woman's eyes, cut deeper than she had expected. And the silence, the way no one had spoken up, the way they had all watched it happen and chosen to do nothing. It was almost worse than the woman's hostility. Olivia took a slow, deep breath, reminding herself of what she already knew. She was stronger than this. She had faced worse. She had overcome greater obstacles. She had built a life that most people could only dream of. And yet, even as she repeated those words in her mind, the bitterness still lingered. It always did. She sat stiffly, her shoulders brushing uncomfortably against the edges of the narrow chair. The transition from the luxury of first class to the cramped space of economy was more than just physical. It was emotional. She hadn't been moved because of a seating error. She had been pushed aside because of someone's unspoken prejudice. The low hum of conversation around her felt distant, like a muffled soundtrack to a moment she hadn't chosen. She glanced out the window, watching as the dark sky swallowed the last glimmers of city lights. The rhythmic whoosh of the plane's engines should have been calming, but instead it only amplified the tension coiling inside her chest. Her mind buzzed, a mix of frustration, disappointment, and exhaustion. There was a time when she would have fought back, when she might have demanded respect, when she would have refused to move. But tonight, the weight of countless similar encounters was too heavy to carry. The subtle slights, the overt judgments, the constant battle to be seen as equal. They had piled up like stones, each one adding to the burden. And tonight, it felt unbearable. She closed her eyes, resting her head against the stiff headrest. She had always been used to being underestimated. Even as a young girl growing up in North Carolina, she had learned quickly that the world wasn't fair to people who looked like her. Teachers had doubted her abilities, despite her natural aptitude for science and math. Professors had treated her as an outsider, even when she outperformed her classmates. Patients had questioned her credentials, expecting someone who looked different. But she had pushed through. She had risen above every challenge. She had built a career that most people would never reach. And yet, here she was, once again, forced to compromise her dignity for the comfort of someone else's ignorance. A familiar tightness grew in her chest, and for the first time since she had stepped onto this plane, she wondered if she would ever be able to let it go. Sitting in the cramped economy seat, Dr. Olivia Reed found herself replaying the moment in first class, how she had swallowed her pride, how she had moved without making a scene. She knew she had done the right thing in terms of keeping her composure, but part of her wished she had stood her ground. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of laughter from across the aisle. She turned her head slightly, spotting a group of businessmen chatting loudly. Their suits slightly disheveled, their ties loosened as they settled into their seats. One of them, a middle-aged man wearing a silver tie, leaned toward his colleague, a smirk playing on his lips. "Looks like someone couldn't handle first class," he muttered, his voice low, but not low enough. Olivia's jaw tightened. She turned her gaze back toward the window, forcing herself to keep her expression neutral. But she could feel it, the slow, rising burn of anger in her chest. She had spent years mastering the art of masking her emotions, of keeping her face composed, even when every fiber of her being wanted to lash out. But tonight, it was harder than usual. The man's words echoed in her mind, a cruel reminder of how often people assumed she didn't belong. It didn't matter that she had earned her place. It didn't matter that she had worked twice as hard as many of her peers. There were always people like him. Whether it was in a hospital boardroom or a first-class cabin, there were always people who looked at her and questioned why she was there. Olivia took a deep breath, trying to let the anger roll off her. But it clung to her like a shadow, refusing to be ignored. She glanced down at her phone, checking the time. The flight had barely begun, and the thought of enduring several more hours of this tension made her stomach churn. Then, suddenly, the plane hit a patch of turbulence. The cabin shuddered, overhead bins rattling as passengers murmured nervously. Olivia instinctively gripped the armrest, steadying herself as the plane rocked through the air. But her mind was elsewhere. The frustration that had been simmering inside her since she boarded the flight threatened to boil over. As the turbulence subsided, Olivia's thoughts drifted back, years back to her time in medical school, the beginning of her journey. A journey into a world that had often felt unwelcoming. She thought of the long nights spent studying until her eyes ached, the exhausting rounds of clinical rotations, and the constant pressure to prove herself. There had been moments of triumph, yes, but there had also been moments of doubt. Times when she had wondered if the weight of her identity was too much to bear in a field that didn't always value her contributions. One particular memory surfaced, her third year of medical school, her first clinical rotation in the emergency department. She had been eager, full of energy, ready to learn, but her enthusiasm had been met with skepticism. Patterson, an older white attending physician with a gruff demeanor, he hadn't bothered to hide his doubts about her abilities. And then came that night. A code blue rang through the halls, a patient in cardiac arrest. Olivia had been the first to respond, her hands moving instinctively as she performed chest compressions, guiding the medical team with a calm confidence that belied her inexperience. And the patient had survived. The rest of the team had praised her quick thinking. But Dr. Patterson? He had barely acknowledged her. Instead, after the chaos settled, he had pulled her aside, his tone cold and condescending. "You were lucky this time," he had said, his eyes narrowing. "But don't get too comfortable. You've got a lot to prove if you want to make it in this field." His words had stung, but Olivia had forced herself to smile and nod, knowing that any sign of weakness would only fuel his doubts. It hadn't been the first time someone had questioned her abilities, and it wouldn't be the last. But she had pushed through. She had risen above the judgments of people like Dr. Patterson. And now, sitting in the cramped economy seat, those memories felt all too familiar. The faces had changed, but the underlying bias remained the same. She was still fighting for space in a world that often refused to make room for her. Olivia sighed, closing her eyes as she tried to shake off the heaviness of the past. She was stronger now. She was more resilient. She had built a career as a respected emergency physician, and no one could take that away from her. The plane steadied, the turbulence fading into a gentle hum. Dr. Olivia Reed forced herself to relax, inhaling slow, measured breaths, syncing with the steady rhythm of the engines. She needed to clear her mind, to let go of the tension that had settled in her chest. After all, there was nothing she could do now. She had chosen to move to economy class to avoid a confrontation. Now, all she could do was endure the long flight ahead. Her body, exhausted from the events of the evening, finally began to succumb to sleep. But just as she started drifting off, a piercing sound ripped through the cabin. A child's cry. High-pitched, panicked, desperate. Olivia's eyes snapped open, her heart racing. She recognized that cry. It was the boy from first class. Every trace of exhaustion and frustration vanished as her instincts took over. She unbuckled her seatbelt without thinking, already moving. Her eyes darted to the front of the cabin where she saw him. The boy. He was struggling in his seat, his small hands clawing at his throat, his face flushed red with fear. He was gasping, but no air was reaching his lungs. A familiar dread settled over Olivia. She knew exactly what was happening. And at 30,000 feet, with no hospital nearby, every second mattered. She rushed forward, weaving through the narrow aisle toward first class. The flight attendants were already gathered near the boy's seat, their faces pale with worry. But from the uncertainty in their eyes, it was clear. They didn't know what to do. And then, there was his mother. The same woman who had demanded that Olivia be removed from first class. Now she was frantic, her hands hovering helplessly over her son, her voice rising in panic. "Baby, just breathe. Please breathe." But it was clear he couldn't. His breaths were shallow, uneven, his chest rising and falling in quick, desperate gasps. Olivia didn't wait for permission. She knelt beside him, placing a steadying hand on his back. "I'm a doctor," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the panic. She turned to the boy's mother, looking her in the eyes. "He's having an asthma attack. Does he have an inhaler?" For a moment, the woman, Melissa, Olivia recalled from overhearing her name, looked at her as if in a daze. Then, as though snapping out of a trance, she shook her head frantically. No, he left it in the car," she stammered, her hands trembling as she clutched her son's arm. "I thought he wouldn't need it." Olivia's heart sank. An asthma attack at this altitude, without an inhaler? They were running out of time. But Olivia's voice remained calm, steady. "Listen to me," she said, her gaze locked onto Melissa's. "I need you to help me keep him calm. The more he panics, the harder it will be for him to breathe. Can you do that?" Melissa's eyes were brimming with tears, but she nodded, her fingers tightening around her son's hand. Olivia turned to the nearest flight attendant, who was hovering anxiously. "I need oxygen, now." Her tone left no room for hesitation. The flight attendant nodded quickly and rushed off to retrieve the supplies. Olivia turned back to the boy, who was still gasping for air, his small body tensing with each failed breath. She softened her tone, speaking directly to him. "Hey, buddy," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I know this is scary, but I'm going to help you, okay?" His wide, fear-filled eyes met hers. Even through the panic, she could see it, the trust he placed in her. "I need you to try something for me, okay? Take a slow breath, like this." She demonstrated, inhaling deeply, then exhaling in a steady stream. The boy tried to copy her, but his breaths were still shallow, frantic. Still, he was trying. That was something. The flight attendant returned, oxygen tank in hand. Without missing a beat, Olivia took it, swiftly attaching the mask to the boy's face. She adjusted the flow, watching closely as his breathing began to slow, just slightly. But she knew. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The oxygen flowed steadily, and Dr. Olivia Reed watched closely as the boy's breathing began to slow. It was still labored, but the panic was fading. Beside her, Melissa's voice was thick with emotion as she whispered to her son, "You're going to be okay, baby. Just keep breathing. Dr. Reed is helping you." Olivia glanced at Melissa, noting the shift in her tone, the softness, the gratitude that hadn't been there before. Just hours ago, this woman had looked at Olivia with disdain, dismissing her as if she didn't belong. And now? Now she was depending on her to save her child's life. But Olivia didn't dwell on it. There was no time for that. The boy's breathing was still unstable, and without an inhaler, they were relying entirely on the oxygen to keep him calm. Olivia focused all of her attention on him, guiding him through each breath, her hand steady on his shoulder. Her voice remained calm, even as her mind raced with potential scenarios. If his condition worsened, they wouldn't have a choice. They would have to make an emergency landing. As she worked, Olivia could feel the weight of the other passengers' eyes on her. The earlier indifference in the cabin had been replaced with something else: respect. But she didn't care about that. All that mattered was keeping this child safe. With each passing moment, the boy's breathing steadied. His chest no longer rose and fell with frantic, desperate gasps. Melissa sat beside her son, never taking her eyes off him. But there was something else in her gaze now, something deeper, more vulnerable. Olivia could feel the shift between them. Melissa had gone from treating her like an outsider to depending on her completely. And it wasn't just desperation, it was realization. Realization that she had been wrong. Wrong to judge Olivia. Wrong to assume the worst. Wrong to reduce her to nothing more than the color of her skin. Melissa's voice shook as she whispered, "I don't know what I would have done without you." She looked at Olivia, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry. For everything." Olivia didn't respond immediately. She kept her focus on the boy, adjusting the oxygen mask, monitoring his breathing. But she felt the weight of Melissa's words, the unspoken apology hanging in the air between them. Melissa swallowed hard, her voice cracking as she spoke again. "I judged you. I treated you terribly. And now, I can't believe I did that." For the first time, Olivia met Melissa's gaze. Her expression was calm, unreadable. "Let's focus on your son right now," Olivia said softly. "We can deal with the rest later." Melissa nodded quickly, wiping away a stray tear. "Thank you," she whispered. Olivia turned back to the boy, a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside her. She wasn't looking for gratitude, she wasn't looking for an apology, but the shift in Melissa's tone and her attitude was undeniable. It was a reminder of how quickly perceptions could change, of how easily someone could go from seeing you as less than to realizing that their life, or the life of someone they loved, was in your hands. The cabin had fallen silent. The tension in the air was palpable as the passengers watched. But now, their discomfort wasn't about what had happened earlier. It was about this moment. Olivia could sense it. Their unspoken unease. Because now they weren't just watching her be mistreated. They were watching her save a life. And they didn't quite know what to do with that. For a fleeting second, Olivia allowed herself to feel the weight of it all. The exhaustion, the frustration, the injustice of having to prove her worth over and over again. But she didn't let it consume her. There would be time for reflection later. Right now, she had a job to do. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but the tension in the cabin began to ease. The boy's breathing was now regular, his face still pale, but the panic had left his eyes. His small fingers clutched his mother's hand, but the terror that had gripped him earlier had subsided. Olivia exhaled slowly, allowing herself the smallest moment of relief. She stood, her knees stiff from kneeling for so long. A flight attendant stood nearby, her face filled with quiet awe. Olivia met her gaze and spoke calmly, firmly. "We need to keep him on oxygen until we land." She straightened, adjusting her posture, her voice steady. "If anything changes, we'll need to make an emergency landing." The flight attendant nodded quickly, already moving to inform the captain. Olivia let out a slow breath, rolling her stiff shoulders. But she knew this wasn't over yet. Melissa remained seated, her hands still wrapped around her son's, but her eyes stayed locked on Dr. Olivia Reed. Her expression was an uneasy mix of guilt and gratitude. As Olivia moved back to her seat, she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her once again. But this time their gazes were different. There was no judgment, no dismissal. Instead, there was something else: respect. She didn't need their validation. But in this moment, it felt good to know that they finally saw her for who she really was. A doctor, a professional, someone who had earned her place in the world, no matter what anyone else thought. Despite the brief relief that came with stabilizing the boy's breathing, Olivia knew better than to let her guard down. Asthma attacks were unpredictable, especially at high altitudes, and without his inhaler, they were merely buying time. She glanced at him, his small chest rising and falling under the oxygen mask. He was calm now, but his skin was still pale, and she could hear the faint wheeze in his breathing, a troubling sound that sent a ripple of concern through her. Melissa, still seated beside her son, sensed the tension lingering in the air. Her earlier panic had faded, but in its place was a quieter, more fragile fear. She watched Olivia closely, her hands trembling as she stroked her son's hair, her eyes darting between him and Olivia as if waiting for some kind of reassurance. Olivia kept her voice steady. "He's stable for now, but without his inhaler, we need to be prepared for things to change. We need to stay calm and keep him breathing slowly." Melissa nodded, her face pale, drawn, but Olivia could see the fear in her eyes. "You're not saying this is over, are you?" Melissa whispered, barely loud enough to hear. Olivia shook her head slightly, her expression serious. Asthma attacks can flare up again without warning, especially in conditions like this. "I'll stay with him and monitor his breathing, but if things get worse..." She hesitated for just a moment before finishing. "We'll need to make an emergency landing." The words seemed to hit Melissa like a brick. Her mouth opened slightly in shock, her fingers tightening around her son's hand. "Oh God, I can't believe this is happening," she whispered. Her voice broke as she added, "How could I forget his inhaler?" Olivia heard the guilt creeping in, but she didn't have time to address it. They needed to stay focused. The boy was still vulnerable, and his breathing was beginning to grow more labored by the minute. The low murmur of voices in the cabin had faded. Now the other passengers were watching the scene unfold, their expressions tense and anxious. It was as if the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And then, as if on cue, his breathing hitched, his small body stiffened, his hand shot up to his throat, his fingers grasping at nothing, as though trying to pull air from the empty space around him. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. His oxygen levels were dropping. The mask wasn't enough anymore. She moved quickly, kneeling beside him again, her mind racing through every possible scenario. "We need to get more oxygen into him," she said sharply. She turned to the flight attendant hovering nearby, her voice firm. "We need to prepare for a descent. I'm serious, we can't wait much longer." The flight attendant, Emma, Olivia remembered, nodded quickly and rushed toward the cockpit, her face pale as she spoke into her radio. Olivia returned her focus to the boy. She kept her voice low and steady, guiding him through each breath. "Come on, buddy, I need you to take slow breaths, okay?" She placed her hand gently on his chest, feeling the rapid, uneven rise and fall of his lungs. His eyes were wide, darting between her and his mother, who was now crying softly beside him, clutching his hand as if she could will him to breathe. Time was running out, and they were still at cruising altitude, too high for his lungs to handle this without proper treatment. Olivia turned to Melissa, who was nearly beside herself with fear. "Listen to me, Melissa," she said, her voice urgent but firm. Melissa snapped her gaze to Olivia, her expression filled with helplessness. "I need you to." Melissa nodded through her tears, trying to compose herself enough to do what Dr. Olivia Reed asked. She leaned closer to her son, her voice trembling, but filled with a mother's desperate love. "It's okay, baby. We're going to get you through this. Just keep breathing, okay?" Olivia watched her closely. The woman who had once demanded Olivia be removed from first class was now just a mother, terrified of losing her child. There was no room for anger, no resentment, no judgment, just fear. the pure, consuming fear of a mother who didn't know if her son would make it through the next hour. Then, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been notified of a medical emergency on board. We will be making an emergency descent to Kansas City International Airport. Flight attendants, prepare for landing." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin, but Olivia felt a wave of relief. Finally, they were taking action. The plane began its rapid descent almost immediately. A sudden drop in altitude sent a pressure shift through the cabin, making passengers shift uneasily in their seats. But no one complained. Everyone understood this was life or death. Olivia remained by the boy's side, her hands steady on his shoulder as she monitored his breathing. The oxygen mask was still in place, but she could see the strain in his face, the tightness around his eyes, the pale hue of his skin. She leaned in closer, her voice soft but firm. "You're doing great. Just keep taking those deep breaths. We're almost there." Melissa, still clutching her son's hand, looked up at Olivia, her face streaked with tears. "What if we don't get there in time?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Olivia met her gaze, her expression calm but serious. "We will. We're doing everything we can right now. You're doing everything you can. Just stay focused on him." Melissa nodded, pressing her lips together as she tried to hold back another sob. Gone was the indignant woman who had dismissed Olivia earlier. In her place was a mother consumed by fear and guilt, her entire world narrowed down to the small boy struggling for breath beside her. Then, the plane jolted violently, hitting another patch of turbulence. A shudder ran through the cabin. Passengers gripped their armrests, their eyes darting around in unease. Olivia braced herself, her fingers tightening around the armrest beside the boy's seat. The descent was rough, fast and bumpy, but there was no other choice. They had to get on the ground as soon as possible. Emma, the flight attendant, returned from the cockpit, her face tight with concern as she knelt beside Olivia. "We're about 15 minutes from landing," she said quietly. "The paramedics will be waiting on the tarmac as soon as we touch down." Olivia nodded, her focus never leaving the boy. "Good. Tell them he's having a severe asthma attack. We've been using oxygen, but without his inhaler, his airways are still constricted." Emma gave a quick nod and relayed the message through her radio, her voice tense but professional. Olivia appreciated her efficiency. There was no room for hesitation now. As the plane continued its descent, Olivia glanced around the cabin. The other passengers were watching her. Their faces reflected a mix of fear, concern, and something else, something that looked like awe. The businessman from earlier, the one who had mocked her for being moved to economy, was staring at her now. His wide eyes held something she hadn't seen before. Recognition. For the first time, they were seeing her for who she truly was. But Olivia didn't care about that. All that mattered was getting the boy through the next 15 minutes. The tension in the air was thick, as if the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting for the descent to end. The boy's breathing was still shallow, but his eyes had closed, his small body finally relaxing under the steady flow of oxygen. Olivia kept her hand on his shoulder, her heart pounding as she counted down the minutes. For Melissa, each second felt like an eternity. She couldn't tear her eyes away from her son. Her face was etched with the kind of fear only a parent could understand. Then she whispered, her voice choked with guilt, "I should have brought his inhaler." Her fingers tightened around his small hand. "How could I be so careless?" Olivia's voice was gentle but firm. "This isn't your fault, Melissa. You're here now, and that's what matters. You're doing everything you can." Dr. Olivia Reed's voice was steady, but she could see that Melissa was still drowning in guilt. Melissa nodded, but her eyes remained clouded with remorse. She looked at Olivia again, her expression raw with emotion. "I treated you so horribly earlier. I didn't even give you a chance. And now you're the one saving my son's life." Olivia held her gaze, her face unreadable. There were 1,000 things she could have said, but now wasn't the time. "We'll talk about that later," she said quietly. "Right now we need to focus on your son." Melissa's tears spilled over, but she nodded. She held her son's small hand tightly, as though afraid to let go. Olivia could feel the weight of the unspoken apology between them, but she didn't dwell on it. There would be time for that later. Right now, all that mattered was getting him safely on the ground. The minutes crawled by, each one stretching into eternity. The plane continued its rapid descent, and Olivia could feel the pressure in the cabin shift as they dropped in altitude. The boy's breathing was still labored, but he was holding on. Olivia stayed by his side, guiding him through each breath, her own anxiety hidden behind a mask of calm. Then, a jarring thud as the wheels hit the runway. The screech of the brakes filled the cabin as the aircraft slowed to a crawl. Olivia let out a long breath, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. They had made it. The flight attendants moved quickly, opening the door as soon as the plane reached the gate. Within moments, the paramedics were on board, moving efficiently as they assessed the boy's condition. Olivia stepped back, letting them take over, but not before giving them a brief rundown of what had happened. "He's stable for now, but he needs immediate treatment," Olivia said, her voice calm but urgent. "He didn't have his inhaler, and we've been using oxygen to keep him breathing." The paramedics nodded, working swiftly as they placed him on a stretcher. Melissa followed closely behind, never once taking her eyes off her son. As the paramedics began wheeling him toward the exit, Melissa turned back. Her face was a mixture of gratitude and remorse. She met Olivia's eyes and whispered, "Thank you. I don't know how to thank you." Olivia gave a small nod, her expression calm but tired. "Take care of him," she said quietly. "That's all that matters right now." Melissa's lips trembled, but she nodded. Then she turned and followed her son off the plane. The cabin remained silent as the door closed behind them. The tension finally broke. Passengers shifted in their seats as though waking from a trance. Olivia stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the past few hours settle over her. She had done what she always did, saved a life. But the emotional toll of the night pressed down on her. The unspoken conflicts, the quiet victories, they tangled together in a way that left her feeling both triumphant and exhausted. The hum of conversations slowly returned to the cabin. The other passengers were coming out of their stunned silence, their voices low and uncertain, as if unsure how to process what had just happened. Olivia could feel their eyes on her. But this time, their gazes didn't feel like judgment. They felt like respect. She returned to her seat, feeling the weariness settle into her bones. Her muscles ached from the tension of the last few hours, and her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She was relieved that the boy was safe, but the emotional aftermath of her confrontation with Melissa still hung over her like a storm cloud. A voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Emma, the flight attendant. She approached quietly, her face filled with sympathy. "Dr. Reed," she began softly, "thank you so much for everything you did. I don't know how we would have handled it without you." Olivia nodded, offering a tired smile. "I'm just glad he's okay." Emma hesitated for a moment. Then she glanced around the cabin before speaking again. "You handled everything so gracefully, even after." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Even after what happened earlier with that woman." She sighed, her voice thick with regret. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Olivia's smile faded slightly. Her eyes turned distant. She remembered the scene from earlier. Melissa's sharp, dismissive tone, the cold look in her eyes, the utter lack of respect. It felt so distant now, overshadowed by the crisis that had unfolded afterward. But the hurt was still there, lingering beneath the surface. "It happens more often than you'd think," Dr. Olivia Reed said quietly, her voice tinged with a deep weariness. Emma, the flight attendant, nodded, her expression filled with quiet understanding. "If there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable, please let me know." Olivia gave a small nod in thanks, but all she really wanted was peace. As Emma walked away, Olivia leaned back into her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The other passengers were still whispering, their voices a low hum drifting through the cabin. But Olivia wasn't listening. She was too tired to care what they thought, too tired to wonder if the respect they now showed her was genuine, or if it was simply because they had seen her save a life in front of them. She could still feel their eyes on her, but they weren't the same judgmental stares from earlier. The businessmen from before, the ones who had mocked her move to economy, were now silent. Olivia glanced at them briefly. She caught the nervous flicker of their eyes as they avoided her gaze. She could see the discomfort on their faces, the subtle shift in their posture. They had seen her differently before. They had dismissed her. They had judged her. But now, their opinions had shifted, and it was clear that they were uncomfortable with that realization. Olivia sighed, her mind drifting back to Melissa. The woman's tearful apology echoed in her thoughts, a stark reminder of how easily people could change their tune when they realized they were wrong. But the apology didn't erase the hurt. It didn't undo the fact that Melissa had judged her without knowing a thing about her. And yet, in the end, Olivia had chosen to rise above it. She had done her job. She had saved a life. She had set aside her own feelings in the process. It was what she had always done. But tonight, the weight of it all felt heavier than usual. The plane began its final preparations for takeoff back to Charlotte. Olivia allowed herself to close her eyes, letting the hum of the engines wash over her. She would process everything later. Melissa's apology, the other passengers' newfound respect, the bitterness that still lingered in her chest. But for now, all she wanted was a moment of quiet, a moment to breathe. The plane had landed at Kansas City International Airport, and the boy had been rushed into an ambulance waiting on the tarmac. Olivia watched from the doorway of the plane as the paramedics worked quickly, Melissa hovering close to her son, still pale with fear. The flight crew was busy coordinating with the ground staff, ensuring that the rest of the passengers remained seated while the medical team did their job. Olivia stood in the jetway, a little removed from the rest of the cabin. The cool night air drifted in from outside. Her pulse was still elevated. Her mind replayed the last few hours in sharp, vivid detail. The adrenaline that had carried her through the emergency was beginning to wear off, and in its place, a heavy weight settled over her. A mixture of exhaustion and emotional fatigue. She had done her job. She had saved him. But the events of the night, the confrontation with Melissa, the judgment she had faced from the other passengers, it still gnawed at her. The silence in the first-class cabin had been the hardest to bear. No one had spoken up for her. And even now, even though they were safely on the ground, she knew that most of them would prefer to forget what had happened. The paramedics lifted the boy into the back of the ambulance. Melissa turned and looked back at the plane. Her eyes scanned the crowd, until they landed on Olivia. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Olivia could see the storm of emotions on Melissa's face. Relief, guilt, gratitude, and something else, something unspoken. Olivia nodded at her, offering a small, reassuring smile before turning back toward the cabin. She didn't need to hear the words Melissa might have wanted to say. It was enough to know that her son was in good hands, and that Melissa had seen what she hadn't before. But the heaviness in Olivia's chest lingered. There was no satisfaction in being right. Not when it came at the cost of such an emotional ordeal. The flight attendants began preparing the cabin for takeoff once more. Olivia made her way back to her seat. As she walked down the aisle, she could feel the eyes of the passengers following her. Their expressions were a mix of awkward sympathy and quiet admiration. The businessmen who had made snide remarks earlier, now, they sat stiffly in silence. Their eyes cast downward. They had reevaluated their initial judgments, but their silence still felt empty. Too little, too late. The businessmen sat in stiff silence, their eyes cast downward. It was clear that they had reevaluated their initial judgments, but their silence still felt empty. Too little, too late. Dr. Olivia Reed slipped into her seat, leaning back and closing her eyes as the sounds of the plane faded into the background. She had hoped for rest during this flight, but now, the thought of closing her eyes and drifting off felt impossible. The weight of the night's events hung over her like a shadow, refusing to let her go. The flight attendant, Emma, returned to check on her. "Dr. Reed," she said softly, crouching beside Olivia's seat. "I just wanted to thank you again. I don't know what we would have done without you." Olivia opened her eyes, offering a tired but grateful smile. "You're welcome, Emma. I'm just glad the boy is okay." Emma hesitated, glancing around the cabin before speaking again. "It wasn't just that," she sighed. "I'm sorry about what happened earlier with that woman. You shouldn't have been treated that way." Olivia's expression remained neutral, though she appreciated Emma's sincerity. "It happens," she said quietly, "more often than it should." Emma's face tightened with discomfort. "Well, for what it's worth, you handled everything with so much grace." She straightened slightly, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I'll be writing a report to the airline. I'll make sure they know exactly what happened tonight." Olivia nodded, though she knew that no report would truly change the underlying issues that led to the situation in the first place. She had faced prejudice her entire life, and she knew that it wasn't something a single incident could fix. But Emma's gesture was kind, and Olivia appreciated that. "Thank you," she said softly. "I appreciate that." Emma smiled briefly before standing and moving on to check on the other passengers, leaving Olivia alone with her thoughts once more. After about an hour on the tarmac, the flight was cleared for takeoff again. The passengers had grown restless, but no one complained, perhaps out of respect for what had happened, or perhaps because they were simply too shaken to care. As the plane ascended into the sky, Olivia leaned her head against the window, watching the city lights fade into the distance. The cabin was quiet now. The passengers were subdued, but the silence didn't bring Olivia the peace she had hoped for. The events of the night continued to play on a loop in her mind. The moments of tension, the hostility from Melissa, the fear that had gripped everyone during the emergency. Olivia had thought she could move past it, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. A low, persistent burn that refused to go away. She had risen above it. Yes, she had done what was right, even in the face of blatant disrespect. But why? Why should she always have to be the bigger person? As the plane reached cruising altitude, the flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering refreshments. Olivia declined. Her stomach was too knotted with frustration to even think about eating. She needed to focus, to process what had happened, to figure out how to move forward. Just as she was about to settle back into her seat, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Dr. Reed?" Olivia looked up. Standing in the aisle was Melissa. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Her hands were clutched together nervously. Her expression was filled with remorse. "Can I?" Melissa's voice trembled. "Can I sit with you for a moment?" Olivia hesitated. Her emotions were still too raw to engage in any sort of meaningful conversation. But she could see the desperation in Melissa's face, the genuine regret. And Olivia knew Melissa was struggling with more than just the guilt of forgetting her son's inhaler. With a small sigh, Olivia nodded. "Sure." Melissa slid into the seat across from her, her movements tentative, as if she wasn't sure she deserved to be there. She opened her mouth to speak, then hesitated. Her eyes filled with tears once more. I don't even know where to start," Melissa said, her voice thick with emotion. She swallowed hard. "I treated you so horribly earlier." Her voice cracked. "And now, after everything you did for my son, I just don't know how to make it right." Olivia looked at her. Her expression was unreadable. Her voice was calm, but firm. "Why did you do it?" Melissa's breath hitched. "Why did you assume I didn't belong in first class?" Melissa's face crumpled. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, her fingers shaking. Melissa's voice trembled. "I don't know. I mean, I know, but I didn't think." She shook her head, struggling to find the right words. "I grew up in a place where people like me didn't." She hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. "We weren't exposed to people like you. I was raised to think a certain way, and she exhaled shakily. "I didn't question it." Dr. Olivia Reed felt her stomach twist. She had heard this story before. Too many times. The excuses, the explanations. People weren't born with hate in their hearts, but they were taught to see others as different, as lesser. And sometimes that teaching went so deep, they didn't even realize they were carrying it with them. Melissa swallowed hard. "I thought you were going to judge me," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I saw you sitting there and I just assumed you didn't belong." Her eyes filled with shame. "That you were going to look down on me, and I don't even know why I thought that." Her voice cracked. "But then, you helped my son." A tear slipped down her cheek. "And I don't know how to fix what I did." Olivia's chest tightened, a mixture of sadness and anger. She had faced this kind of prejudice her entire life, people making assumptions about her, doubting her abilities, treating her as if she didn't belong. And yet, here was Melissa, finally realizing the weight of her own biases, asking for forgiveness, as if that alone would erase what had happened. Olivia's voice was soft but firm. "You can't fix it." Melissa flinched. Olivia met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "You can't undo what you did." She paused, letting the words sink in. But you can start by asking yourself why you felt that way in the first place. Melissa nodded quickly, her tears falling freely now. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I will. She placed a trembling hand over her heart. I swear I will. The plane hummed softly around them, but between them, there was silence, a long, heavy silence. Olivia studied Melissa carefully. She could sense the remorse, but she also knew this moment of clarity didn't mean everything would change overnight. Olivia's voice was steady. I don't need your apology, Melissa. Melissa's lips parted slightly, surprised. Olivia continued, what I need is for you to take what happened tonight and learn from it. Her eyes sharpened. Teach your son differently. Melissa sucked in a breath. Make sure he grows up seeing people for who they are, not what they look like. Melissa nodded quickly, her lips trembling. She wiped at her eyes. I will, she whispered again. Her voice was filled with resolve. Olivia held her gaze for a moment longer, then exhaled. She leaned back in her seat. That's all I ask. Melissa sat there for a few moments more, her face etched with guilt and determination. Finally, she stood, her hands still shaking slightly. She whispered one last, thank you. Then she turned and walked back to her seat. Olivia watched her go, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in her chest. She had heard these kinds of apologies before, had seen people realize their mistakes, had heard them promise to do better. But change was hard. And it wasn't something that happened in a single conversation. It took time, and it took effort. As Olivia watched Melissa return to her seat, her shoulders slumped under the weight of what she had learned tonight. Olivia allowed herself a small sliver of hope. Maybe this time, it would be different. The flight continued its journey to Charlotte. Olivia remained in her seat, staring out the window at the dark expanse of sky. The conversation with Melissa had left her feeling drained. But there was also a sense of resolution, a quiet understanding that while the world wasn't perfect, there was always room for growth. Olivia's mind drifted back to her childhood, to the lessons her parents had taught her about resilience, about strength. Growing up as a black girl in the South, she had learned early on the world would not always be kind. People would judge her before they knew her. But her parents had also taught her something else, to stand tall in the face of adversity, to let her actions speak louder than words. And tonight, that's exactly what she had done. She hadn't needed to prove herself to Melissa, or to anyone else on that plane. Her actions had spoken for her, her skills, her knowledge, her compassion. And in the end, that was what had made the difference. As the plane began its descent into Charlotte, Olivia allowed herself to exhale. The long journey was almost over, and soon she would be back in the comfort of her own home, away from the scrutiny of others, away from the weight of the night's events. But the lessons from tonight would stay with her, just as they always had. Each experience, each confrontation with prejudice, it all added to the layers of strength she had built over the years. And she knew she would carry that strength forward, no matter what came next. It wasn't fair. It wasn't easy, but it had shaped Dr. Olivia Reed into the person she was today. A person who saved lives, a person who rose above ignorance, a person who stood firm in her identity no matter what the world threw at her. The plane touched down smoothly. As the passengers gathered their belongings, Olivia remained seated for a moment. She let the weight of the night slowly lift from her shoulders. She had done her job, she had done what she always did, and she would keep doing it, because that was who she was. As the passengers filed out, several of them gave her small nods, subtle gestures of respect. She nodded back, though her mind was already elsewhere. The next flight, the next emergency, the next moment where she would be called to rise above it all, again. And she would, because no matter what happened, she knew she was strong enough to handle it. As the plane taxied toward the gate at Charlotte Douglas International Airport, Olivia felt a deep sense of relief wash over her. It had been a long, emotionally exhausting journey, one that had tested her patience, her resilience, and her strength in ways she hadn't expected. But she had made it through. And now, she was home. The familiar airport lights flickered outside the window. The quiet hum of the engines felt almost like a lullaby compared to the chaos of the last few hours. Olivia leaned back, allowing the tension in her shoulders to ease as she watched the passengers gather their things. Despite the exhaustion weighing on her, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had done what she came to do, not just as a physician, but as a person. She had saved that little boy's life. She had risen above the prejudice she faced. And she had handled the night's challenges with the grace and professionalism that had defined her entire career. But most importantly, she had maintained her integrity, even in the face of blatant disrespect. As the last few passengers stepped off the plane, some offered her quiet thank yous. It wasn't recognition she had sought. She never did. But it was a reminder that her actions hadn't gone unnoticed. Even in the face of adversity, she had proven exactly who she was. Olivia waited until the cabin had cleared before finally standing and gathering her belongings. Her muscles ached from the long flight. Her mind still buzzed with the weight of the night's events. But as she made her way down the aisle, there was a lightness in her step, a sense of closure. As she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the familiar buzz of the airport surrounded her. People rushed past, luggage rolling behind them, conversations blending into a dull hum. For a moment, Olivia simply stood there, taking it all in. The airport was the same as always, busy, chaotic, a place where people moved from one destination to the next without stopping to reflect. But for her, this arrival felt different. It felt like an ending and a beginning. She inhaled deeply, then exhaled, and started walking. Her suitcase rolled quietly behind her as she moved through the terminal. She was ready to put the night behind her, to leave the tension and the emotions on the tarmac, and step back into the life she had built. A life defined by purpose, by dedication, not by the opinions of others. As she walked, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from her friend and colleague, Dr. Angela Moore. Just finished my shift. How was the flight? Olivia let out a small, tired smile. Angela had been her closest friend since residency. There was no one else who understood the unique challenges Olivia faced quite like her. It would be good to talk to someone who got it, someone who didn't need an explanation, someone who just knew. Olivia typed back, "Long story, I'll fill you in tomorrow." She hit send, and just as she slipped the phone back into her pocket, it buzzed again. This time from an unfamiliar number. "Dr. Reed, it's Melissa Jenkins. I just wanted to thank you again for everything you did for my son. He's stable now, and the doctors say he'll be okay. I owe you more than I can say. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm working on being better. For my son's sake, and for mine. I hope one day I can show you that I've changed." Olivia stared at the message for a long moment. Her mind replayed the conversation she had with Melissa on the plane. The apology, the tears, the genuine regret in Melissa's voice. She had meant it. Olivia knew that much, but she also knew. Change isn't proven in words, it's proven in actions. She exhaled and pocketed her phone. She didn't respond. Not yet. Not because she was holding on to anger, but because Melissa's journey was her own. If she truly wanted to change, she had to do it on her own. As Olivia reached the baggage claim, she immediately spotted her suitcase. She grabbed it and turned toward the exit. The cool Charlotte air greeted her as she stepped outside, and for the first time in hours, she felt like she could truly breathe again. The taxi ride home was quiet, giving Dr. Olivia Reed time to reflect. The city lights blurred past the window as she thought about the weight of the night's events. The emotional highs and lows, the moments of fear and quiet triumphs. Being an emergency physician, Olivia was used to life or death situations. Every shift brought a new crisis, a new challenge that tested her ability to remain calm under pressure. But tonight had been different, because tonight it wasn't just about saving a life. It was about confronting prejudice. It was about navigating the fine line between professionalism and the emotional toll of being judged, for something as arbitrary as the color of her skin. Melissa's apology had been sincere, but Olivia knew this wasn't an isolated incident. The world was full of people like Melissa, people who carried prejudices deep within them, people who often didn't even realize they had them. And for people like Olivia, that prejudice was a constant presence, something she had to confront time and time again. In subtle ways, in blatant ways. But tonight, she had chosen to rise above it. She had done what she always did, used her skills, her compassion, her resilience to help, to heal. Even those who had treated her as if she didn't belong, not because she had something to prove, but because she had stayed true to who she was. As the taxi pulled up to her house, Olivia paid the driver and stepped out onto the quiet street. The familiar sight of home filled her with a comfort she hadn't realized she was craving. Her house was modest but cozy, nestled in a quiet neighborhood just outside the heart of the city. For Olivia, this was her sanctuary, her place of peace. After long shifts in the chaos of the emergency room, this was where she could breathe. She walked up the steps, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The warmth of home wrapped around her like a familiar embrace. She dropped her bags by the door, kicked off her shoes, and made her way to the kitchen. Pouring herself a glass of water, she let herself pause for the first time all night. The night had been challenging, yes, but it had also reminded her why she did what she did, why she had chosen this path despite the obstacles. Being an emergency physician wasn't just about saving lives. It was about being a source of strength in the face of fear, a beacon of hope when everything felt hopeless. And though the prejudice she had faced tonight was painful, it hadn't broken her. If anything, it had reminded her of her own resilience, of the quiet power she carried within her. She had faced darkness, in the medical emergency, in the judgment of others, and she had emerged on the other side, stronger than before. The next morning, Olivia awoke to the soft light of dawn filtering through her window. Her body still ached with exhaustion, but there was peace in it. She had made it through another challenge, and today, she would return to the hospital, ready to face whatever came next. The morning air was crisp and cool as Dr. Olivia Reed stepped outside, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. She had woken up with a dull ache of exhaustion, but also with a quiet sense of renewal. Last night's events would stay with her, as all such experiences did, but they wouldn't define her. There was work to do, patients to treat, lives to save, and a future to build. Before heading out for her shift, Olivia sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through emails. There were messages from colleagues, updates on patients, a few reminders about upcoming meetings, the usual flurry of hospital life. But after the intensity of the flight, it felt grounding, like a return to normalcy. Then, a new message appeared in her inbox. From Melissa Jacobs, Dr. Reed, I just wanted to let you know that Ethan is doing much better this morning. The doctors say he'll make a full recovery. I can't thank you enough for what you did. And I'm still thinking about everything we talked about. I know it's a long road ahead, but I'm committed to making changes, for Ethan's sake. And for mine. Olivia read the message twice, letting the words sink in. A part of her wanted to respond, to offer encouragement or advice. But she knew real change had to come from within. It wasn't something that could be given to someone. Melissa's journey was her own. And while Olivia had played a role in sparking that change, it was up to Melissa to continue down that path. She set her phone down and finished getting ready for work. As she drove to the hospital, the city of Orchard Hill awakened around her. Sunlight reflecting off the skyscrapers, people moving through the streets, a world carrying on. Olivia allowed herself a small smile. The world was far from perfect. There would always be challenges. But she had faced them before, and she would face them again, with strength, with resilience, and with grace. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, subscribe for more inspiring stories. Leave a comment about what resonated with you. Like and share to spread the message of resilience and compassion. Every voice matters, and every story has the power to change hearts. Thank you for being a part of this journey.